Well, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome. Thank you for joining us for today's 30-minute webinar. So my name's Laura Hill from Cloud Essentials, and as your host, I'm going to start by setting the scene a little bit. As you know, or many of you know, here at Cloud Essentials, we are all about helping businesses like yours really get the most out of your Microsoft 365 licenses. But we do see a need for third-party platforms to sometimes run alongside Microsoft 365, mainly for two reasons. Firstly, where there are gaps in functionality, or maybe where some of the native functionality is out of reach, perhaps because of the cost of the higher tiers of licensing. And secondly, where maybe it's just best practice. Maybe as an organisation, you need to take a belt and braces approach to things. So this webinar today aims to kind of pick apart, I suppose, the native backup and recovery functionality available in the E3 license, and yeah, just help you challenge really whether it's up to the job of protecting your organisation's data. So we've got a bit of a face-off today. On my left, I have Chris Hathaway, our Director of Cloud Governance. Chris has got a really great working, hands-on knowledge of Microsoft 365 capability. He is very pro Microsoft 365 backup. I'm always hearing Chris encouraging our customers to really try and just get their heads around native security and governance functionality and get using it to its full potential. On my right, I have our cloud storage guru, Jeff Bourgeois, from our partner HubStore. And yeah, every day, Jeff is helping organizations globally to use HubStore as a platform for backing up Microsoft 365. And many customers of ours at Cloud Essentials subscribe to the HubStore platform, and we do see them get a lot of value out of it. So I'm going to hand over to the experts in just a moment, but I just wanted to say, I suppose give a bit of context as to why we decided to host a more of an open discussion about it. And it's really because of what we're seeing within our customer base, and yeah, just three things really that we're seeing customers kind of grapple with. Firstly being, look at the Microsoft services agreement. Microsoft themselves have put a clause in there to say that you should use third-party tools to back up your data. Why do they say that, and what is the impact for you if you don't do that? Secondly, we regularly hear from customers who have struggled with the native Microsoft recovery tools, and maybe you've had similar tricky experiences, or maybe you're bracing yourself for a point in time where you have to use them. And thirdly, there is an ever-present and evolving threat to our data, in the form of malware in its many different forms that could, let's face it, severely compromise our businesses. So to what degree does having a separate backup and recovery tool add an extra layer of protection to that? So that's enough from me. Chris, over to you to present why you think Microsoft are really nailing it when it comes to native backup and recovery.
Yeah, so I'm a little bit like the chum in the water for the sharks, as you can tell. Laura and my team and my old friend Jeff from HubStore will be well versed in a lot of what I'm talking about, but are really using me as the debate. But they also know that as part of what we do as Cloud Essentials, we do like to challenge any vendors we use, any business systems we use, anything we advise, you can be sure we thoroughly tested and challenged amongst ourselves. And since I live in Cape Town, I'm well used to living in those waters and spending time in those waters. So hopefully I can make my way through and give you some of my perspective on where and how I do or don't see a backup for Office 365 being necessary. So do Office 365 customers need, and I've put the word traditional backup, and my answer is no. I think that backup is often used by IT departments as a bit of a fail-safe because they're either a little unsure of what's available in Office 365 or more because perhaps information management is actually what's required, and the information management tools within Office 365 might not be the traditional tools that an IT administrator are used to working with and dealing with. And I guess what's a little bit different to the traditional ecosystem on site is these are the tools which are going to protect your data, and I'll speak to that a little bit more as we move along. I guess one of the things we've seen is certainly from things like traditional exchange systems on site. Those of us who've been around those for years and years will know there are many tools. There are MTAs on there for security and for spam and virus and for archiving and for e-discovery. And really the point of Office 365 is it's not just for one, which is one of the things I often bump into. It's not just a mail system. It's in fact a complete ecosystem of a collaboration platform, and within that collaboration platform there are a lot of facilities, tools and functions which should be replacing third-party systems that you may be running on site. And if you're not, perhaps you haven't looked at them deeply enough, so you mind just advancing there again. Thanks, Laura. Yeah, so as I said, often it's driven by that lack of information management, such as retention and information management requirements, which an Office 365 platform needs, because, you know, as I said, that is how the protection of information or protecting your data is done. And that lack of understanding may make you feel better to have a traditional backup, but possibly not required. And as we all know, it's really about bang for buck and budget versus function versus what you're paying Microsoft for the licensing. Sometimes we have come across customers where there is a lack of trust in Microsoft or in the Office 365 platform itself. Obviously, it's difficult to speak to that. A part of our process is we do take customers through the trust center and help them understand who owns the information, how it's owned, and where and why you can trust. And certainly in our experience, the Office 365 platform has been very stable, and certainly from a vendor perspective, is if you can't trust Microsoft as a vendor, then, you know, I think you'll struggle to trust any of the other cloud vendors as well. So if you wouldn't mind advancing again, Laura. Yeah, so as per any sort of software as a service platform, Microsoft's job and what you're paying for in that licensing is to look after the infrastructure, and that includes the high availability. You know, in the old days we'd have things like database access groups and things. Those days are a thing of the past. These are functions you don't need to worry about anymore. They're geo-redundancy, the way they build their data centers, the security around their data centers. These are all things you're paying for in your enterprise licensing. So you need to be sure you're taking advantage of those things and you're focusing on the things which you need to be focused on, which is retention policies, for example. Immutability, from I think about Exchange 2010 or possibly even sooner, Microsoft built immutability into Exchange. There are also things like version control in SharePoint and OneDrive, which will also follow on to Teams. And version control, for example, properly set up, it's available to you, but it's not switched on by default, will protect you from things like ransomware, because it effectively makes a version of a document immutable. If there is some form of attack, it's going to keep the prior version and see the new version as a new version. So make sure you're taking advantage of these things. There is security and identity and endpoint management is also a very important part of the ecosystem. You need to understand that needs to be configured appropriately for your environment. It's really key and critical. It's not just about backup. You know, making sure you have the appropriate security and endpoint management in place is also going to help you protect your information, which is going to drive you know, where and how and why you need that backup platform. So what's available natively and what have you paid for? So E3 licensing, which is what most of our customers will have and up, usually with what we call the EMS stack, will include, for example, the retention of legacy users. So users who leave your organization, even if you reassign their licensing, will stay on your retention policies. It's worth noting retention policies are not the same as legal hold. Retention policies are there to retain the data. Legal holds will override a retention policy. But retention policies are important and are included in that licensing. Then there are what I call the 3 stages of recovery. And this could be where it can become a bit awkward and there may be room for a third-party system, or there may be a requirement or a business case for a third-party system. But there are the 3 levels, and stage 1 is really that self-restore. Stage 2 is the administrator restore from the platform, and Microsoft has built this way. They're in the recycle bin. There are in fact 2 recycle bins, one for the user, and then the second one for the admin restore. And then after specific periods of time, and again, this will depend on what you've set up or whether you're using the default. The last stage, which is really awkward from an IT administrator perspective, is what I call the search and e-discovery console, which is in the compliance center. And in here, regardless of what's happened to information, as long as your retention policies are in place, i.e. sort of that left-hand side of your EDRM model, or the left-hand side of how you look after your information for discovery and search, the data will be available. It won't have that connective tissue around it anymore, and it'll be a little bit, it won't necessarily be able to be restored exactly to where it came from, but you will be able to get back to it. So probably the worst part about the search and discovery, the stage 3, if it gets to that point, is that's often not an IT administrator. That's usually someone within information management or risk within the business, or in fact the legal or internal legal department. So this is not really a function that's designed for an IT backup or restore type function, but it is available to you should you need it. So I think just to round up a little bit, it's worth looking at that shared responsibility model for a SaaS solution. These are the elements which you need to provide. These are the elements which Microsoft will provide to you as the service provider, obviously, as you can see there. But where it becomes the ownership of your information, or if it's anything to do with your information and the management of the information, it is going to remain with you. The same with identity and access management, which is a shared responsibility with the vendor. You need to make sure that you have put the controls available to you in place. Those controls don't come by default. We spend a lot of time doing what we call a security and governance baseline audit, which is preferably done before you deploy onto Office 365. That can also be done as an audit or a checkpoint process to ensure that you are, 1, leveraging the licensing that you've bought, 2, potentially replacing unnecessary third-party systems wherever possible and using the licensing you're paying for, whether you use it or not. That's really important, the security baseline. That said, there is room for what I call a modern backup or archive, and there really is a convergence between backup and archive for cloud. And there definitely are specific areas where we've seen that requirement, for example, as a preservation lake for legacy email, really old email, but you need to keep it for 30 years, 20 years. It's not appropriate potentially because it's journal style information. It doesn't come from a mailbox. There's certainly use a case there. Some of our customers have started using third-party applications on top of Office 365 within SharePoint, for example, where they're now using document and records management features, but using Office 365 as the backend. And in these cases, there may be a requirement for additional backup of those sources as a kind of third party, and because the information is really critical to the knowledge and the business information. Some of the other areas are specific regulations around data sovereignty. Some of our customers will have a specific regulation where they have to prove at least one copy of the data exists within the boundaries of the organization. You may not have an Office 365 data center within your region, or you may just need that from just a business sovereignty perspective. We've also seen with larger organizations where they may be, changing or limited shareholding of two organizations, but they share an Office 365 tenant. We've also seen a requirement there where they've asked to have their own copy of the information so that they're not held ransom should there be a change of shareholding or a merger or divestiture within the organization. Of course, there's the furloughed users, with users leaving and returning, and then driving efficiency. A modern, sensible cloud backup can be a really powerful tool to being able to quickly get users back online and get their information back to where it needed to be, or allowing users that are left behind to access that information.
Actually, Chris, we had a question come into us. So whilst we have an audience with you, let me just get this up. So an attendee messaged us to say that they were only just starting to move to Office 365. So just wanting to have our view on recommendations for a starting point, as a backup process. Just where to begin in designing that process and designing a process for testing that.
Yeah, so that's a really good point. One of the things is, even if you were to back Office 365 up, what would you restore and where would you restore it to? Bearing in mind you don't have access to the back-end infrastructure. Even if you were to spin up your own workloads into Azure and then restore into them, it would take weeks or days with the volume and the rate of change of information. So very importantly, where we would start is with that security and governance baselining process, which makes sure that you've switched on the required retention, the required security, the required version control, because that's all about looking after your information. Then look to a modern system such as HubStore, which is properly connected in the cloud to Office 365, lives alongside it in Azure, and is able to then really look at the information and the content and allow you to manage the information content side by side with Office 365 rather than a process of trying to run a remote or a secondary system. So yeah, where I would start, to cut a long story short, start with the governance process and the security setup process properly. Once you've done that, identify the areas where you may need more. So do a gap analysis on where you may need more than what is available on the native Office 365 features. And then you can also look to, Office 365 will also be able to restore. It does take some time and it might not meet your SLAs. And certainly look at the workloads where you're going to need that. Once you've got that, we would then look at the relevant tools that are going to meet those requirements, and then obviously test those tools and make sure that they can actually meet your SLAs where you need those tools. But as you know, I'm all for making sure you've done everything you can natively, getting your bang for buck out of your licensing. And once you've done that, then look at the gaps and make sure you've got a really good tool that understands Office 365 and is built from the ground up for Office 365. Rather than a tool that's kind of been retrofitted into the cloud from the old days on site.
With that, I'll hand you back to Laura, who will hopefully hand Jeff to the Sharks.
So big thanks to Chris for giving us his thinking around native Microsoft 365 backup and recovery. I'm going to throw the mic over to Jeff to pick things up from the other side. But in our interlude, I was just thinking of a customer scenario that we've got. We're working with a construction company at the moment, multinational company, quite a lot of users, 20,000 plus users, and they're actually pretty savvy when it comes to Microsoft 365, and a lot of the functionality that Chris was talking about would be very familiar to them, but they've been really struggling with point-in-time restores of OneDrive. They have found themselves responding to a lot of user requests from VIP users to do restores, and are finding themselves swamped in that process of ad hoc searching and restoration. So I think they would appreciate what Chris was saying about the functionality available, but it wouldn't be particularly helpful to them in the scenario that they find themselves in at the moment. So Jeff, perhaps let's hear from your side of the fence, and maybe that's a situation that you can help us out with.
Okay. Well, Laura, I think you just debunked Chris's position right there. So just end the call now. It's an interesting point, though. We've heard that before. People have a hard time, particularly with OneDrive. And we'll talk a little bit more about why OneDrive is sort of a primary target. But, the native recovery tools are a bit of a trick. The key thing to keep in mind with software as a service, Chris is right. The cloud provider, the SaaS provider, they are indeed taking care of the backup of the infrastructure, okay? But of course, if you look at the fine print in any SaaS subscription agreement, you own the data durability, right? If there's some sort of data loss or what have you, it's your problem for the most part, right? And we'll talk about where it is for the most part. But basically the cloud provider, in SaaS, it's typically a multi-tenant scenario. And so what that means is that they have an environment or multiple environments, and they pool multiple customers onto the shared infrastructure. And so it's very much in the SaaS provider's interest to make sure that service is highly available. You're typically going to find SLAs, things like that. They've got, failover capabilities. And yes, they are backing up the databases and the storage and all that stuff. However, right, that backup, you don't have access to it. Or if you do have any access, kind of like in Office 365, you've got the native recycle bin, that access is very limited. It's through a sort of a clunky or a cumbersome, or very, small kind of feature setted GUI. You don't own that backup copy of the data. You don't control it. And so for a lot of people, if you don't own and control it, you don't really have a backup. But anyway, the key thing is you want to think about with SaaS is that it's your data and the data is your responsibility. So when you think about, with that said, that, what really is the risk, right? That the SaaS provider is on the hook for, backup and high availability and DR and things like that. So, you really don't have to worry about, system level failures too much. They seem to be very, very rare, right? However, SaaS data loss can happen. And the way that it happens is typically not a system-wide failure or some sort of regional failure. Those things, there's a lot of fault tolerance there, but it tends to be more malicious and accidental user activity. That's much more likely, okay? So insiders quite often. But this brings us back to OneDrive being sort of a hot topic for Office 365 backup and recovery. It's that ransomware can really impact your data in SaaS apps. And OneDrive in particular, because as we know, most people have OneDrive syncing to their devices. That's typically, a Surface laptop. We've experienced it a few years ago in our company where there was a OneDrive account. It had 20, 30,000 files in it, very elaborate folder structure. And that was a OneDrive that was shared out to multiple users. One user gets hit with ransomware on their laptop or some sort of malware that went through and ultimately deleted thousands and thousands of files. And of course, that went and deleted the cloud copy. The deletion then synced out to multiple users' copies on their devices. And going to the recycle bin was it didn't give us a full recovery. Okay. So OneDrive is indeed your biggest threat vector. I have seen YouTube videos demonstrating ransomware that's also written for mail and exchange online. So ransomware is an issue as well, but malicious and accidental user activity where things are deleted by a user, so it seems legit. those are also going to be scenarios that are going to have you thinking, man, I need a good SaaS backup and recovery solution. So how do you have good insurance tools from ransomware or any type of data loss in a SaaS environment? Immutability, as was touched on earlier, that helps. Versioning helps, of course, just simply because you've got this copy that can't be modified. But in the SaaS world, if you think about Office 365, it's great that you've got this sort of safe copy through immutability or through versioning, but how easy is it to leverage that as a backup to do a reliable point-in-time recovery? And that's really where the trick lies. Now, some of the native recovery options are a little bit difficult to work with. And we'll just zero in on the OneDrive recycle bin. We've experienced, and we've heard from many customers that have had the same experiences, that the flexibility is very limited, right? If you test this yourself, if you head into the recycle bin restore capability, you are not able to do a restore externally or out to some alternate OneDrive location. Okay, it only goes back to the original spot, and that can be a little nerve-wracking sometimes, because if you have a partial or you're not sure exactly what's deleted, you sometimes you want to have a feeling of like, I know I'm not going to be overwriting other changes. It's a merge, or I want to make sure that I know what we're going to recover, and I want to inspect the data before I go put it back. There's no ability to kind of just dump the files out to file directory and do a diff on them or anything like that. It's just, hey, you got to just hit the restore button and keep your fingers crossed and hope it comes back. You get the result you want. It's also very difficult to navigate the recycle bin. So if you look at it, it's like this long list of items, and if you have, we've had scenarios where it's 10, 20,000 items that you need to recover. It's painful. Okay, so there's no way to just do a search and say, hey, it's just this item, or just data between this sort of, these file types or what have you, or where this person's the author. You can't do filtering like that. But the bigger issue we found is that it's really unreliable at scale. When we had to do a recovery, we would get numerous errors where stuff just wouldn't recover out of the recycle bin, and even that was very difficult. Well, how do you can we get a dump of the error log, and can we isolate those items easily and try other things with them? The answer is no. But we've heard horror stories out in the field where people have been unable to they can see it in the recycle bin, they can't get it out of the recycle bin. There's no resolution as to why they can't restore something out of the recycle bin. So those are some things to keep in mind. Test for yourself. But for those reasons, we find customers want to create a reliable backup copy that they own, okay, that they control, and that offers much more flexible and just reliable recovery capabilities. So with HubStore, what we do is we help companies by having a white glove, fully managed backup that runs in the cloud, and the customer, as the customer, you have control to tell, determine where it's hosted. So you have some data sovereignty control. It's yours. It's not a shared infrastructure, and it can scale. We have customers that are hundreds and hundreds of terabytes of mail and OneDrive data that they're backing up. And so when you're thinking about this kind of backup solution, there are many Office 365 backup solutions out there. Most of them are a virtual appliance that's going to run in the cloud, kind of a do-it-yourself, maintain and run it yourself approach. A lot of them don't scale very well. We hear that quite common, that if you have more than a few terabytes in SharePoint or OneDrive or Mail or all together, a lot of the Office 365 backup products out there are not going to scale. So you're going to have to look for something that really is an enterprise solution if you have more than 1,000 users or so. So this time I'll switch gears and just do a brief product demonstration. And what I'm going to show you briefly is a HubStore environment. This is the admin portal, and you can see, of course, there's a whole bunch of things you can do here, but this kind of, imagine that this is your window into your backup environment as an admin, okay? And so When we go into the administration area, we can see, for instance, that this environment has a number of storage accounts. Under the hood, these are very scalable Azure blob storage accounts. The data has synchronous redundancy and encryption. We can even be doing like PII detection and in cloud backup as well. So, but you can see in my environment, I have a storage account here for SharePoint and OneDrive. That could include Teams as well. So there's a bunch of data being stored there. I'm just going to click this link again because my authentication session is probably expired. And you'll see I have a storage account for email, and this can be Teams chats, conversations, user mailboxes, discovery search mailboxes, public folder mailboxes. And so here's another storage account. We have another one here for the Office 365 audit log as well. So that's data that you can satisfy for long-term retention in HubStore. So that's just a quick look into the sort of backup storage that exists. So there's what we call the export utility. It allows you to pull data out of these backup storage accounts, and you can do all sorts of recovery and export scenarios. So I sign in, I'm signing in as an administrator to the HubStore tenant. I'm using that's Azure AD that's authenticating us. And you'll see here that I have the ability to look at these storage accounts where our backup sits. And there are a number of different scenarios that I can actually do from a recovery perspective. So if I look at email, I can dig in, I can see my, different backup policies essentially. And if I wanted to, I can drill in and see the different mailboxes. So I can do a multi-mailbox restore, a single mailbox, folder level, or even individual items, okay? So you can browse the structure of your email backup as well. If you were to go into like SharePoint, Teams, OneDrive sites, you can browse that hierarchy here as well. So if I wanted to look at some OneDrive for business accounts, if let's say this user here, Margaret Hayes, had some sort of deletion or some sort of malware that wiped out a ton of her OneDrive data, very easily I just would hit Documents folder here, and you'll see very simply I could say I want to restore all items, and it's by default, it's just a merge of what's missing. So it's non-destructive restore. But you could also do specific items. You could select individual items, or you can even use metadata filters. So if you wanted to say, well, I want to restore everything, to her OneDrive library, but I only want to use specific date ranges, or even filter, maybe it's data that's a certain size or certain file types. And you can see content types, things like that. So it's pretty flexible in terms of what you're going to restore. And here's the other cool part. You have a lot of flexibility in terms of where you want to restore or export that data to. So you could push it back to that user's site collection, but you could also restore it to an alternate site collection, even in a different Office 365 domain that your organization has. Or you might opt to push the data out to a file path or Azure Blob Storage account. And similarly for email, you have the flexibility to restore to a PST file, a mailbox, or you can even output email to a file path or Azure Blob Storage account. So it's very flexible in terms of being able to do restores or do sort of alternate recovery scenarios. And with that, I will hand it back to you, Laura.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Jeff. So. Yeah, just to wrap things up, really, I suppose some conclusions I'm drawing from these two sessions are that, from what Chris was saying, moving to 365 backup and recovery really is a kind of mental shift from traditional thinking, and you're kind of selling yourself short if you're not really embracing all of the native 365 features that Chris mentioned. But I know that to use them properly, you really do need that clarity from the business on your stance on data governance and retention and compliance, which is often easier said than done, because then you've got to translate that quite confidently into our 365 configurations, and that functionality, which may be actually quite a new way of thinking and a new way of doing things. But as Jeff was saying, even if you've done all that, you might still just simply not be able to tolerate the risk of not owning and controlling and have easy access to a separate copy of your own data, emphasis on your own data. Also picking up that maybe OneDrive backup makes sense, even just from an operational point of view. You might find yourself needing a slick approach to that. So thank you both. We're going to wrap this session up, but just to say that if you want to get in touch with Chris or Jeff, Stacey King, who you would have heard from with information for these sessions, is your point of contact. And also just to flag next webinar that we're hosting next month, whereby we are going to really question the continued relevance of third-party endpoint security and email hygiene platforms like Mimecast, when you're actually pursuing a Microsoft 365 strategy, and where they fit in or don't fit in. So hopefully you can join us for that. Thanks very much.